We are in lesson number 20 in the book of 2 Samuel, and the title for this lesson is Nothing After a Conspiracy and Mutiny Can Ever Be the Same. Now, as I told you last week, I thought about calling this lesson, Once the Egg is Scrambled, It Can Never Be Put Back in the Shell. Maybe that would have been a better title for this, because that's exactly what's going to happen here. Once things are scrambled up by a mutiny and a conspiracy, things are never the same. In all cases, people are hurt emotionally, they're hurt spiritually, and sometimes even they're hurt physically. And in the significant conspiracies and mutinies that I have mentioned, or that I mentioned several weeks ago with Abraham Lincoln and with John F. Kennedy, people were dead. Families were shattered, and the nation was stunned and absolutely dumbfounded. Well, returning back to our 2 Samuel story, it's all the same, folks. With Absalom's death and immediate burial in a pit covered with rocks, who would tell the news to David? Nothing after Absalom's conspiracy and mutiny could ever be the same. The world in Israel had changed because of it. David's family had changed because of it. David's order to treat Absalom kindly had been disobeyed. And regardless of what Absalom did, he was still David's son, and he was dead. Who would tell David? Ahimaaz, the priest, wanted to deliver the news, but Joab resisted his offer. Finally, Joab instructed a Kushite to tell David, but Ahimaaz insisted. So Joab finally relented, letting Ahimaaz chase after the Kushite and get to David first. And so we have two death reporters in line to deliver the news to David. They're all headed towards David. But let's pick up in the story to read about this. Verse number 19. Then Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, said, "Please let me run and bring the news that the Lord has been freed from the hand of his enemies." But Joab said to him, "You are not the man to carry the news this day, but you shall carry the news another day. However, you shall carry no news today, because the king's son is dead." Ahimaaz said here, the Lord has freed him from the hand of his enemies. Now, that was not the right attitude or the right thing to say to David about Absalom. Joab knew David well. For more than 30 years, Joab had seen the response of David when bad news came. And Joab did not want to tell David. He did not wish Ahimaaz to get on the wrong side of David accidentally. He had been on David's good side through this whole ordeal here. And you should remember Ahimaaz, he was the one that was with Jonathan, and they hid in the well before getting the news of Absalom's plans to David. And so Joab pivoted to a Kushite and gave him the order to tell David in verse number 21. It said, "Then Joab said to the Kushite, 'Go tell the king what you have seen.' So the Kushite bowed to Joab and ran." It was an order, folks. What was the Kushite to do? He obeyed. Now, a Kushite was not a Jew, folks. The Kushites were Nubians. Their skin was black. They're descendants of Cush, the son of Noah. Now, the name of the land of the Kushites was changed during the Roman Empire to reflect the associated name for black, the Latin word Ethiop. Now, today we call it the region of Ethiopia, but in the Old Testament days it was called Cush. And by the way, a group of the same descendants of Cush did not go all the way down into the Kushite area, Ethiopian area. They stayed back, and they held back, and they didn't go down into the African continent after the Tower of Babel event. This group settled in what is today's northern part of Turkey, just south of the Black Sea. Now, Moses will identify the Gihon River associated with the Garden of Eden as going around the land of this second group of Kushites. Okay, so this second group that's not down in Africa, but up African continent, but up by the Black Sea. The Gihon and 3 other rivers are related to the Garden of Eden, and the Gihon River went around this Kushite river area. Now, all 4 of these rivers have their headwaters where they begin right there in the area of the Black Sea, which is the area of the second group of Kushites. Now, when reading in Genesis 2, verses 10 through 14 concerning the Garden of Eden, the land is near the Black Sea. Cush on the African continent, folks, is just way too far away. So the Gihon River can't go all the way down from the Black Sea, across Turkey, through Syria, down the land bridge that we call the Promised Land, west across the Arabian Peninsula, south through Egypt, running parallel to the Nile River, and then end up going around the country of Ethiopia or Kush down in south in Africa, on that east coast of Africa. It's simply too far. Now, to simplify it, the other 3 rivers mentioned by Moses all began also right there at the Black Sea, as they still do today. Why would the Gihon be any different? But there's a problem here. The path I just described would have to overrun the Pishon River, which is one of those rivers that came out, which ultimately fed into the Sea of Galilee, and then goes down after it dumps into the Dead Sea, and all the way down to the Sea of Aqaba. So the problem is we can't have these waters splitting across each other. So this Kushite group that's up above is a different group, just when you run across it in the Bible. And so our Kushite in this story was probably from Africa, of African area, and he was an Ethiopian. We'd call him from what we call Ethiopian today, if it was him from today. But we must ask, why was a Kushite from either Kushite locations fighting with the Israelite army of David? This answer is easy also. The Lord's law allowed for all foreigners to live in the Promised Land on one condition: if they put their belief in the worship of the Lord, the same worship of Israel, and entered into a covenant with the Lord through circumcision. No doubt, this Kushite was a believer in the God of Israel. This requirement was placed on Ahithophel, the Canaanite, if you remember. That's Bathsheba's father. Uriah, the Canaanite, that was Bathsheba's husband. Ittai, the Philistine, he would have had to have this same circumcision. All of these were aliens living with the people of Israel, and they had to do this according to Deuteronomy chapter 31:12, which says this: assemble the people, the men and the women and children, and the alien who is in your town, so that they may hear and learn and fear the Lord your God, and be careful to observe all the words of this law. Aliens were to fear the Lord just like the Israelites. The word fear here in this context means to worship reverently. But Ahimaaz was not happy with Joab's decision that he could not run. So we come to verse number 22, and it says this: Now Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, said once more to Joab, but whatever happens, please let me also run after the Kushite. And Joab said, why would you run, my son, since, catch this, you will have no reward for going? Ahimaaz was not willing to accept what Joab said. So Joab warned him, why would you run, my son, since you will have no reward for going? No reward. Those 2 words should have shaken Ahimaaz, but they did not. Ahimaaz was willing to accept whatever David did and said when hearing the news. He said in verse number 23, but whatever happens, he said, I will run. So he said to him, run. Then Ahimaaz ran by way of the plain and passed up the Kushite. What will David do with Ahimaaz is my question. What will David do with the Kushite is my next question. But first, we hear what David thought when the 2 came running to the gate at Mahanaim. Now David was sitting between the two gates, and the watchman went up to the roof of the gate by the wall, and raised his eyes and looked, and behold, a man running by himself. The watchman called and told the king, and the king said, "If he is by himself, there is good news in his mouth." And he came nearer and nearer. Then the watchman saw another man running, and the watchman called to the gatekeeper and said, "Behold, another man running by himself." And the king said, "This one also is bringing good news." The watchman said, "I think the running of the first one is like the running of Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok." And the king said, "This is a good man and comes with good news." David was comforted, by the way, with that Ahimaaz was coming, and that he was seen coming. And then when the second was seen, more comfort came to David. They were running to him. No doubt, the speed at which they were running caused David to think that it was good news. They weren't moping along. Well, Ahimaaz was the first to get to David and to report. Verse number 28 tells us what he said, or what happened. Ahimaaz called and said to the king, "All is well." And he prostrated himself before the king with his face to the ground, and he said, "Blessed is the Lord your God, who has delivered up the men who lifted up their hands against my lord the king." The king said, "Is it well with the young man Absalom?" And Ahimaaz answered, "When Joab sent the king's servant and your servant, I saw a great tumult, but I did not know what it was." Then the king said, "Turn aside and stand here." So he turned aside and stood still. Ahimaaz's report did not satisfy David, I guess you can tell. Ahimaaz could not directly answer that Absalom was well. The compiler did not tell us that Ahimaaz was with Joab when Absalom was killed. Neither does the compiler tell us that Ahimaaz helped to bury Absalom. Therefore, anything Ahimaaz would have told David would only have been hearsay. Nevertheless, Ahimaaz answered David the best he could in the most truthful situation. He was a good man. He answered it truthfully. And notice that Ahimaaz did not say to David what he intended to say to David. You remember, he told Joab he was going to say this: "The Lord has freed him from the hand of his enemies." David would not have accepted that language very well. Now Ahimaaz stumbled in his answer, and David must have realized something was wrong. And because of the way he answered David, David stood him to the side to wait for the testimony of this second reporter who was running so fast to get to him. The Kushite, that second reporter, arrived in short order behind Ahimaaz, and David questioned him as he did Ahimaaz. Verse number 31. "Behold, the Kushite arrived, and the Kushite said, 'Let my lord the king receive good news, for the Lord has freed you this day from the hand of all those who rose up against you.' The king said to the Kushite, 'Is it well with the young man Absalom?' And the Kushite answered, 'Let the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise up against you for evil be as that young man.'" Okay, the Kushite did not say things were well with Absalom. Did you notice that? Instead, he said something similar to what Ahimaaz had planned on saying. "Let the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise up against you for evil be as that young man." And with those words, David knew that Absalom was dead. What did David do with Ahimaaz and the Kushite? We do not know. But we know that we will not hear the name of Ahimaaz again in the scripture after this meeting with David, except for one place, when Ezra, years later, mentions his name in the Chronicles, but only as him being one of the sons of Zadok. But nothing about him is found after he tells David, "All is well for the king." All was not well for the king. His son was dead. By the way, neither will we hear anything about what happened to the Kushite. Now the battle with Absalom had brought battle sufferings to King David with this news. Moreover, the death of his evil son has grieved him, that his son wanted him dead. That grieved David greatly. Verse number 33 tells us this. The king was deeply moved and went up to the chamber over the gate and wept. And thus he said as he walked, O my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would I had died instead of you, O Absalom, my son, my son. The fact that David went up to a chamber over the gate to sit tells us that Mahanaim was a walled city with 2 walls and 2 sets of gates. The fact that it was a double-walled city actually tells us this. It had an outer gate and it had an inner gate. And between those 2 gates, which were in those 2 walls, there would be 2nd and 3rd story chambers built by placing perpendicular walls to them all around. And these walls had a primary purpose and a secondary purpose. The primary purpose was to stabilize those 2 walls that protected the city. But the secondary purpose was they would make rooms in those walls where people could live and for living quarters. And so all double-walled cities were built the same way. Now, what was the cause of David's great anguish as he sat in one of these chambers between these 2 walls? 2 things come to mind. First, his tender heart loved Absalom despite Absalom's sin of despising him. Second, his angry king's heart despised Joab's sin of disobeying him. Had David known Joab would disobey him, David would have rather gone into the battle and died than face the death of his son. David will not forget Joab's disobedience, but he will not handle Joab. Instead, he will pass that on and instruct Solomon to handle Joab in 1 Kings chapter 2, verses 31 through 33. Now, nothing after a conspiracy and mutiny can ever be the same. David's sorrow for Absalom insulted Joab. Incensed, we hear from Joab. David's great admonition spoken by his commander comes to him in chapter 19, verse 1. It says, Then it was told Joab, Behold, the king is weeping and mourns for Absalom. The victory that day was turned to mourning for all the people, for the people heard it said that day, The king is grieved for his son. So the people went by stealth into the city that day, as people who are humiliated steal away when they flee in battle. The king covered his face and cried out with a loud voice, O my son, Absalom, O Absalom, my son, my son. Now the victory over the mutiny turned into the brokenness of the people. These people were David's people, not Absalom's people. These people hurt because David hurt. There was no joy in the victory for David and no joy in the victory because of David. The people heard David's cry from outside the walls, and they said not one word as they entered the city to steal away. They did it by stealth. They didn't say a word. They snuck in. Verse number 5. Then Joab came into the house to the king and said, Today you have covered with shame the faces of all your servants, who today have saved your life and the lives of your sons and daughters, the lives of your wives and the lives of your concubines, by loving those who hate you and by hating those who love you. For you have shown today that princesses and servants are nothing to you. For I know this day that if Absalom were alive and all of us were dead today, then you would be pleased. Now therefore arise, go out, and speak kindly to your servants, for I swear by the Lord, if you do not go out, surely not a man will pass the night with you, and this will be worse for you than all the evil that has come upon you from your youth until now. Wow. He has just given David the what for. You know, it's often hard to take. But those who disobey can often proclaim the most profound truth. Such was the case with Joab. He failed his commander. But his commander read the feelings of Israel perfectly. Joab perfectly read the feelings of Israel. We have heard enough about Joab to develop a character analysis of him. First, he had a warped, undying loyalty to David, as seen in his defense of David through all the battles over the last 35 years. Second, even though he was loyal to David, he often disobeyed David's command and did what he wanted to do and what he thought was right. Third, he was outspoken. He never shied away from speaking his mind to David. Fourth, when he was wrong, he was really wrong. And when he was right, he was really right. Fifth, he spoke to David with a sense of insolence and an air of superiority, almost always. But sixth, he was looking out for David's best and the best of the nation of Israel. And all these traits are so convoluted, but headed in the right direction, because his best was always for David. Now, speaking of the warrior servants who had defeated Absalom's mutiny, you remember Joab had said this: saved your life and the lives of your sons and daughters, the lives of your wives and the lives of your concubines. Now, most Bible readers and students would never catch the tragic truth in these words in this passage. It is a truth that is caught when reading the Scripture, but it's not really taught. Catch this from what I'm telling you. All of David's family had been saved from the onslaught of Absalom. Now, what does that mean? It means that if Absalom had been successful, he would have slaughtered all of his relatives. Now, how can this point be caught in the Scripture? Well, I'll tell you how. If you took the time to analyze an older passage back in Judges chapter 9:5, go ahead and read up in 1 Kings chapter 15:29, 1 Kings 16:11, 2 Kings 10:6, 2 Kings 11:1, you would discover that when a new king came in power to the throne, it was common for all the relatives of the old king to be slaughtered. Joab has assumed that Absalom would have killed them all. In addition, Joab accused David of bringing shame on all of Israel. He said, by loving those who hate you and by hating those who love you. Joab knew the conspiracy and mutiny were all of Absalom's doing. He hated his father and he wanted him dead, but David was mourning the death of the one who hated him and disrespected those who loved him. Joab also accused David of not caring about his sons. He said, for you have shown today that princesses and servants are nothing to you. Then he doubles down to say to David, for I know this day that if Absalom were alive and all of us were dead today, then you would be pleased. His words must have shocked David. And then Joab challenged David not to throw away his kingship and the kingdom by continuing his current mourning, which was a slap in the face of all of Israel. And so David was a wise man that he was, had to consider that Joab was right. The nation as a whole knew about the trouble between David and Absalom. Absalom had propagated that knowledge and caused a division in the nation. And some followed Absalom and anointed him as king of Hebron, and may have done so when he took over Jerusalem also. We don't know about that because we don't know what actually happened in Jerusalem except for the abuse of the concubines. David had run from Absalom to keep his family safe. Some, if not most, of Israel had remained faithful to David. But with the death of Absalom, this division needed to be healed, and David would have to return to his throne in Jerusalem. And Joab was absolutely correct in his counsel to David. David needed to shake off the sorrow over Absalom and the hurt in his family to rise to be the king of Israel anew. What we do not know is found in this question. Did David know then that Joab threw the first spear into the heart of Absalom? We don't know the answer. But probably at this point, David does not know that it was Joab who killed Absalom. Now, after Joab's admonishment, David left the chamber and returned to the gate at Mahanaim in full view of all the people to act as the king. He's taken Joab's advice. But this brings us to the controversy of how and when David would return to Jerusalem and David's great admission that he must make. He says, will the people allow him to return to his throne is the question. After all, nothing after a conspiracy and mutiny can ever be the same. We're going to read in verse 8a. So the king arose and sat in the gate, and when they told all the people, saying, behold, the king is sitting in the gate, then all the people came before the king. So as we pick up here with verse 8b, the compiler is going to now address Absalom's people of Israel. So he addressed the people with David first, and now he's going to address the people who were with Absalom. Verse number 8b. Now Israel had fled, each to his tent. All the people were quarreling throughout all the tribes of Israel, saying, the king delivered us from the hand of our enemies and saved us from the hand of the Philistines. But now he has fled out of the land from Absalom. However, Absalom, who we anointed over us, has died in battle. Now then, why are you silent about bringing the king back? These people who fled their tents were the people of Israel that were attached to Absalom. They've all gone back. They've gone all back to their hometowns amongst the 12 tribes. Now, in fact, after the defeat of the 20,000 men and the death of Absalom, the text says to us, after Joab blew the horn, that all Israel fled, each to his own tent. That's in 2 Samuel 18:17. So they're all back home. And those who supported Absalom began to quarrel with those who supported David across all the 12 nations. Now notice that they concluded that since Absalom was dead, they had to decide now about allowing David to be their king again. So for a review, here's the scene set that caused this exchange. David is back at the gate acting as king. Judah, David's tribe, who supported Absalom and crowned him king in his father's place, is absolutely silent about allowing David to be their king again. But in the mere quarreling, all of Israel was not being silent. They're squawking about this. And we are not told that all of Israel has supported bringing David back to Jerusalem as the rightful king, but we can assume it's because of what David says in the next verse dealing with him, that the controversy is going to turn to the tribe of Judah. In other words, what I'm saying is, the 12 nations are out there trying to decide, and there's more people who support David than supported Absalom. Since Absalom's dead, they're not going to support Absalom anymore. So here we go. In verse number 11, the controversy with Judah had to be addressed. For David, the process was taking way too long, as we can kind of tell in this verse, verse number 11. Then King David sent to Zadok and Abiathar the priest, saying, Speak to the elders of Judah, saying, Why are you the last to bring the king back to his house? Since the word of all Israel has come to the king, even to his house. You are my brothers, you are my bone and my flesh. Why then should you be the last to bring the king back? Okay, so Zadok and Abiathar were still in Jerusalem, serving before the Ark of the Covenant. They were major supporters of David. So he asked them to speak to the elders of Judah. That means he had to send a message, 21 miles, get it to them go to Hebron, to the capital city of Judah, and talk to the elders about Judah's elders supporting David to come back as king. He wanted the priest to talk to the elders of Judah because he had already heard, since we see this in this passage, from the other 11 tribes, not from Judah, but from the other 11 tribes, as the compiler said, that David said, since the word of all Israel has come to the king, even to his house. David has heard it right there in Mahanaim. 11 tribes have reported, we want you as our king. So why was Judah, David's family tribe, holding out? Now, to help pull Judah along, David makes an offer. This is strange to me, but this is what David does. Verse number 13. Say to Amasa, Are you not my bone and my flesh? May God do so to me, and moreover also, if you will not be commander of the army before me continually in place of Joab. Wow, what a slap in the face. Joab had been David's army commander since Joab climbed the sewer gutter to open the gates there at Mount Zion so that David's army could go in and defeat that citadel of the Jebusites that was thought to be undefeatable. That occurred in the 7th year of David's reign. It has now been at least 30 years that Joab has been the second in charge, the commander of David's army. David, of course, is in charge of the army. Joab is the commander, but he's second in charge because David's over him of the army, and he's been that for maybe 30 years, maybe as much as 32 years of David's reign. In other words, Joab had been commander for more than 3 decades. But David was willing to give the job to Amasa, the son of David's half-sister Abigail. Amasa was his nephew. But remember, Joab was the son of David's other half-sister, Zeruiah. Amasa and Joab were first cousins. David was taking the job away from one nephew and giving it to another nephew. What did Amasa do? Verse number 14. Thus he turned the hearts of all the men of Judah as one man, so that they sent word to the king, saying, Return, you and all your servants. The king then returned and came as far as the Jordan, and Judah came to Gilgal in order to go to meet the king, to bring the king across the Jordan. The key to change Judah's heart was David offering to Ahimaaz Joab's job. It's not said here, but this decision by David was undoubtedly because Joab disobeyed David's order concerning Absalom. It worked. Thus the Judah leadership gathered at Gilgal, just east of Jericho, to parade David across the Jordan River and down to the throne in Jerusalem. But then, if you remember, there was also the controversy with Shimiah that needed to be addressed. David did not want to address it, if you remember. Shimei did want to address it. Remember, Shimei cursed David while he was fleeing Absalom. This time, Shimei had a different attitude towards David. Verse number 16. Then Shimei, the son of Gera, the Benjamite, who was from Baharim, hurried and came down with the men of Judah to meet King David. There were 1,000 men of Benjamin with him, with Ziba, the servant of the house of Saul, and his 15 sons, and 20 servants with him, and they rushed to the Jordan before the king. And then they kept crossing the ford to bring over the king's household and to do what was good in his sight. And Shimiah the son of Gera fell down before the king as he was about to cross the Jordan. And so he said to the king, "Let not my lord consider me guilty, nor remember what your servant did wrong on the day when my lord the king came out of Jerusalem, so that the king would take it to heart. For your servant knows that I have sinned. Therefore, behold, I have come today, the first of all the house of Joseph, to go down to meet my lord the king." But Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, said, "Should not Shimei be put to death for this, because he cursed the Lord's anointed?" And David said, "What have I to do with you, O son of Zeruiah, that you should this day be an adversary to me? Should any man be put to death in Israel today? For do I not know that I am the king over Israel today?" The king said to Shimei, "You shall not die." Thus the king swore to him. Shimei was a Benjamite who lived near Baharim, if you remember, in the tribal area of Benjamin. He was not a descendant of Joseph. So why did he say he was the first of all the house of Joseph to go down to meet my lord the king? When David first became king, only the tribe of Judah recognized him as king. The other 11 tribes recognized Ishbosheth as king. Ishbosheth's kingdom was called the House of Joseph. There's our reason. Because his capital city was in the area, it was in Mahanaim, the city we're talking about, in the tribal area of Manasseh. And Manasseh was the oldest son of Joseph. So follow me here. So when David left his hiding place at Mahanaim and crossed the Jordan River to return to Jerusalem, Shimei was at the river to be the first person from the old kingdom of Ishbosheth to welcome David back into the tribal area of Benjamin. He was the first person of all the tribes, not including David's tribe of Judah, to welcome David home. All the 11 tribes had sent word to David that he could remain the king. But Shimei was the first person in flesh and blood to arrive from all those 11 tribes to welcome David back across the Jordan River, to come over to the side where Jerusalem is, to go back to Jerusalem. That is all that means. Shimei knew he was guilty before David, and he admitted his sin. David did not punish him that day because he was not in Jerusalem yet and was not sure that truly all Israel had accepted him, even though he said that he is the king of Israel. But that will come, okay? David's going to punish Shimei. David's not going to forget Shimei. In fact, David will instruct Solomon to deal with Shimei when he is king. Now here's a note. Shimei has only 3 years to live when Solomon becomes king. 1 Kings chapter 2. Well, it is true. Nothing after a conspiracy and a mutiny can ever be the same. Now, after dealing with Shimei, not everyone that needs to be dealt with has been dealt with. If you remember, Mephibosheth had not left Jerusalem. And Ziba had told David that Mephibosheth wanted to become the king in his father's place, in the place of his grandfather, King Saul. And David had been kind to Mephibosheth, so now David is going to have to handle Mephibosheth also when he returns to Jerusalem. Now that'll have to wait until our next lesson together, and we'll see how David handles Mephibosheth.